So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we are going to continue our conversation with the Epistle of First Peter, again, in which Peter is trying to encourage a group of people who are feeling discouraged because they are being oppressed, because they are out of sync with the culture around them. They're considered, dangerous. They're considered antisocial. They're considered not part of it. And Peter is reminding them that in Jesus they have in fact found something better. It's okay being out of sync. In fact, we're supposed to be out of sync with our culture. And so I think that argument kind of culminates in this section of comfort of, again, reminding why it is they have to face some of this oppression, why they in fact have to be just different than everyone else who's around them. So at the beginning of 2 Peter, we read, "Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, 'Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame.' So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who don't believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become a cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." And so we've been talking about different kind of angles, different parts of that, the fact that we are following a rejected Messiah that are through here. And so there's this kind of one last piece I think he wants us to understand, and that's an identity piece, and where this identity of associating with this rejected one ultimately comes from. And so this first section, I think, is one that it's so short, it's easy to kind of skim over, but I think it reminds us of a really important foundation for why people would be willing to follow Christ in the first place. And the image is that of a nursing baby. Now, this isn't Paul's image of immaturity and associating milk and then growing into solid food. It's one of intimacy. It's an image of people that are enjoying one another's presence, that are being nurtured. It's a very special bond between a mother and a baby. There's nothing else really like it. And this is what Peter is comparing us to with God here. He says, "Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good." And so the image of this idea of intimacy, of of having ongoing sustenance, of just being close with God, I love that phrase, of having tasted and seen that the Lord is good. I think this is an incredible and often overlooked foundation for our faith. I think it is really important to follow God because we believe that God is true, that God is the one who made the world and has invited us into a very specific way of being in the world. But I think in the long term, being convinced of the truth of something is not going to be enough unless we have, in fact, and continue to, in fact, experience that the Lord is good. We have tasted, we have seen that God is good. Again, why would these people accept this rejection by their culture, often this rejection by their family, unless they were convinced to their core that they had in fact found something better. Not just something that's true, although it is that, but they are continuing to be encouraged by God. They are continuing to be strengthened by God. They are continuing to experience community, both in their worship, in their daily lives, in taking care of those who are the least by including outsiders, etc., right? The sorts of things God is inviting us into, the sorts of things that God, I think, desires for us. We need that ongoing encouragement. We need that ongoing intimacy and sustenance by God, because I think if we're only signed up for this life of following Jesus because we're convinced it's true, we will eventually I think, succumb to the pressure, right? We will get tired of having a set of beliefs and rhythms of life that are at odds with the culture around us. We'll be tired of being made fun of. We'll get tired of being, embarrassed of the gospel and its demands because it just simply doesn't fit in. And so I suspect that if truth is all that's keeping us there, we are sooner or later going to find an excuse to look for another truth, for another way of being. We'll consider it, outgrowing old former beliefs or something, right? And you see this, you hear this conversation with people. I mean, the very way I think, atheism and science present themselves is this: we're outgrowing these older, more mature, for maturity, even though it's harder, right? And I think this section is a rejection of that, as we are having the strength to reject those beliefs and those ways of being in the world that are around us. We can only do this by experiencing God. And so, what I think we need to remind ourselves is, why did we sign up for this journey in the first place? Why are we following God versus many, many other things which claim our loyalty, which would desire us to follow, right? Did we experience encouragement? Did we experience hope? Did we experience, just a clicking when things made sense, when truth was there? What was it that we originally experienced in God? And are we continuing to have that intimacy with God, that continued sustenance that is referred there? Have we, and do we continue to grow up into our salvation? Have we tasted that the Lord is good? Do we continue to taste that the Lord is good? Because I think the journey of faith at times will be simply too hard unless we continue to be sustained by God. And so the next section, which is going to point out again what it is God is doing and start reminding us of our ultimate identity, I think rests on this foundation of people who have tasted and seen that the Lord is good and therefore are willing to be used by God, are willing to be part of something bigger. And what's bigger is described here in verses 4 through 8. And as you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who don't believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become a cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble because they disobey the word, as they were destined to do. And so this section is kind of a collage of Old Testament stone references, and it's pointing out again that God is building something. God is building a presence, a different community that both shows and enjoys his presence in the world very differently, and that it is going to be rejected by many, many people. Even the majority of people are not going to want in on this thing that God is doing. And the image of building this temple, which of course represents God's presence on earth, where God kind of stakes his claim on earth, I think is a really beautiful one, and one that fits really well with the story of Christianity. And you've got this image of a stonemason walking through kind of the rubble, the construction trash in a lot of way, and recognizing all these other stones, of course, being the capstone, the cornerstone of Jesus himself, who was rejected as a Messiah who wouldn't use violence, who wouldn't use power, as a Messiah who chose to heal and restore people to community rather than draw the line on who's in, on who's out, and attack and fight those they wanted, right? They've rejected that kind of a Messiah, and that becomes the cornerstone. But the image is of God as this laborer wandering through and seeing something in stones that others have rejected, and taking these rejected stones, this trash, this rubble, and building God's presence, building this holy temple. I love the idea of the living temple because stones themselves is too cold of an image, right? He is building something from that which was rejected, that was rejected by everyone else and their ways that they thought God should be, and their ways they think the world should run. And I think this rejection kind of cuts both ways, right? As God has chosen the least, the losers of history, those losers, those rejects that both Peter is writing to and that I think I'm talking to as well right now, we are also called to not just be rejected, but also to reject many of the values that we have around us, the ways of being in the world, the ways of understanding God, the ways we relate to one another, right? We reject a lot of what we've inherited because it is harmful. It is not God's way. And that's the recognition that's throughout this entire passage. Yes, they are rejecting you because you're rejecting them. And in many ways, it brings a criticism. If we are not willing to be about always needing the next thing, if we are willing to be about just being rather than doing all the time, if we are willing to be about the least and those who cannot give us anything or help promote what we're about in any way, shape, or form, we simply are loving as God loved and taking those who are rejected and building something new out of them, being part of what God is up to, right? There is a rejection of the speed our culture often has. There is a rejection of the influencers. There's a rejection of power in the ways we've been using it. And I think that there is a rejection that we have not fully embraced as American Christians. We have not fully embraced the opportunity we are being invited into by God of doing things His way, of being a group of rejects who are at odds with the culture around us, and because of that are free. And yet, there's kind of a plot twist at the very end of this section, right? Because this rejection, both receiving rejection and rejecting the other ways of being in the world, gives us a new form of identity, which comes at the very end in these last couple. Because you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but you have now received mercy. And so one of the big themes in this new piece of identity is that we are claimed by God. You see that a couple times. A chosen race, a people for God's own possession, right? Our identity comes from the fact that we have been claimed by God. We may be rejected, we may be losers according to history, but we believe we are God's, that God has claimed us and that He has invited us into a very different identity as His own beloved children. Another important part of this new identity is that these rejects have a family, have a tribe finally. And it's not the ones we've inherited. It's not the ones we've been rejected from again and again, right? It says, you were once not a people, but now you're God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but you have now received mercy. An important reminder that this is not something that we deserve. It's not because we were so wise, we're able to, unencumber ourselves from our cultural ties. It's not that we were so spiritual that we were able to step away from everything in a way that no one else has. No, we claim those things. We are culturally embedded, and we are selfish, and we lack wisdom, and we lack perspective, except for the fact that God has invited us and given us the ability to respond, right? Um, we have received mercy because God knows we needed it. And so those of us who accept this, saying, yes, I need help, yes, need mercy, we are called into a new purpose and into this new identity, into this new family group. And the last metaphor in here, well, I guess the last two are priests and temples, religious imagery, right? But I want us to remember that a priest's job is not to keep God hidden, keep God far away, right? A priest is supposed to be a bridge between God and other people. And so the irony of this passage that I think is so beautiful is we are rejecting the culture around us for God's sake. We are being rejected because of that. We are outsiders. We are the other, but it's for the sake of everyone else. Our goal, our job eventually, why we were chosen for this, is in fact to invite the very people who reject us and often reject God back into God's presence. We are meant to be a nation of priests, a group of priests that stand between God and other people, that fill in those gaps, that make it obvious and reasonable. We're the bridges to bring people into God's presence, just as the priests were in the rituals, right? And so I love that just as Jesus was rejected by his own people and the world, and he used that fact to offer the opportunity to save us and to reforge that connection with God, we are called to step into that same place, not because we are Jesus, we're most certainly not, but through his strength and his power, we can take being rejected. We can reject a different set of beliefs because our job is to reconnect those who have rejected us, those who have rejected God, back into their true identity as God's children. We are meant to invite people back into the celebration, invite people back to the party that is God's restoration and God's coming kingdom. And then the same thing, what is a temple, right? You are a living temple, we hear a couple times in here. The temple is where people could go to be in God's presence. And so the irony of this new identity is, yes, Peter's encouraging us to be okay with the fact that we are rejected, but we are rejected, we are other because they need us to be. The world around us needs us to offer another way. It needs us to know God well enough to invite them, and as we started at the beginning, to be sustained by God, because nothing else ultimately will sustain. To find intimacy with God, because none of the other things we look for intimacy in are ultimately going to be enough. And so I think this is a very difficult but beautiful passage as well, that when we are connecting with God, when we have experienced God, we can step into an identity as his people, even though it causes us to be rejected. We are rejected for the sake of those around us, to invite them into God's presence as temple, to fill the gaps between them and God as priests, right? Our purpose, our calling as God's people is in fact to invite them into that sweetness, and we invite them also to come taste and see the Lord is good as we have. It's an incredible calling, it's a scary calling, but it's also a real privilege to invite people and to join God on this crazy adventure.